everybody, it's Whitney from All the Shelves, and today I am going to be continuing my series on American literature. I am up to talking about books that were published between 1935 and 1939. The second half of the 1930s are really interesting to me because this is when comic books started embracing and discovering the superhero. Superman was published for the first time in 1938. And from that character's success, superheroes just began to proliferate like crazy. One of the most notable examples being Batman, who was published first in 1939. Batman began as a real knockoff of other characters that had been successful, namely Superman because of the superhero type stuff, but also masked people and Avengers like the Shadow and Zorro. So while these superheroes are brand new in the end of the 30s, they're also like extremely derivative and, you know, honestly not that fun to read. It's fun to see their origins, and it's fun to see like the kind of cultural situations that they are dealing with, but the form itself is just starting to really learn how to use codes in more interesting ways, and the visuals are pretty basic. But I had to start off my 30s videos mentioning superheroes because this is what I study primarily. So let's go back to 1936 with a book that not a lot of people have read, but is starting to get more traction, which is Knightwood by Juna Barnes. I believe that it is impossible to adequately summarize this book. All I can really say is that it is a poetic explanation of a breakup and the slow dissolving of relationships between people. The introduction to this book is written by T.S. Eliot, and he talks about how the book is just basically poetry in prose form, and how you have to be hyper attentive and a very mature reader to understand it. And that's probably true, and I wouldn't even say that I am that mature reader who can understand it. I know a lot of people in my department really love Juna Barnes and study her like quite extensively, and I wouldn't pretend to have like unique and interesting things to say about this book, but I did want to bring it up because, like I said, it's one that not a lot of people read, and I think that people who are interested in language and poetry and in a kind of like magical language and the way that language can transform a situation and describe it without being very literal would really love this book. So just by way of introduction, here is what I think is the perfect description of what a really hard breakup feels like. Looking at every couple as they passed, into every carriage and car, up to the lighted windows of the houses, trying to discover not Robin any longer, but traces of Robin, influences in her life, and those which were yet to be betrayed. Nora watched every moving figure for some gesture that might turn up in the movements made by Robin, avoiding the quarter where she knew her to be, where by her own movements the waiters, the people on the terraces, might know that she had a part in Robin's life. This idea that everything around you is going to remind you of that person, and this desperate desire to remember that person at the same time as remembering hurts so much, and you don't really want to dwell on that and you're looking for escapes. You're still like wanting everyone to know, look, I've been through this like painful experience. I am a part of this person, and this person is a part of me, even if you can't see that person, you know, literally in my life anymore. It's all full of beautiful language like that. Like this line that I just like randomly opened to. Sometimes one meets a woman who is a beast turning human. Like, wonderful. Also, this is an example of LGBT literature that's pretty early and pretty explicit. It's about a lesbian relationship, which I think is very exciting to read about in the 1930s. The next book is Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, published in 1937. This is a book that probably a lot of people have read. It's frequently seen in classrooms, and it is a really good example of what was going on in African American literature at the time period, part of this Harlem Renaissance that you hear spoken of so much. The movement that Langston Hughes was quite a big part of. Zora Neale Hurston was also a part of. And also Nella Larson, who I talked about when I talked about her novel Passing, published in the 1920s, and I will link to, you know, the rest of the series down below. But anyway, this is a book about a woman named Janie who goes through a series of relationships trying to find her voice in that relationship and trying to figure out the best way that she can express her love. It's also a book about how people show possession of each other and take possession of each other, both through their love and through like dominant behavior. So you obviously have relationships between men and women where one is trying to dominate the other, but you also have a relationship between white and black that's about dominance. And really interestingly, you have a relationship about God and humans that's about dominance. And one interesting part, I think, of this is the title, Their Eyes Were Watching God. The idea, I think, that's in this is if you're not watching God and paying attention to him, this all-dominant, omnipotent creator, then does he actually have power over you, or can you live your life as though you are, you know, a free, non-determined person? So anyway, this is a classic piece of American literature, specifically about the African American experience in the South, but also something that I feel could be widely identified with in the 1930s. This is a period of economic oppression so vast and devastating that people were starving to death in this country. And this was in a country that produced a ton of food, but it all had to go to waste because people did not have the money to buy it. So the kind of like economic hardships that are described in this novel would probably be very familiar. The next book I want to talk about has kind of gone out of fashion, and it is Johnny Got His Gun by Dalton Trumbo. Recently, there was a film about Dalton Trumbo. It was like a biographical film, and it was actually pretty good. It had Bryan Cranston in it, and the preview made it seem awful, but I kind of enjoyed watching it. Not, I don't think, an amazing film, but biopics are really hard for me. I don't always love them. But Dalton Trumbo's life was very interesting to a lot of people because he was a socialist who was under attack from the McCarthy hearings. He wrote this book before those trials. This was published in 1938. This is a story of a World War I soldier who wakes up one day in a hospital bed and he has lost full function of his body. He can't see, he can't hear, he can't talk because his face has been blown away, and he also doesn't have any arms or legs. So basically he is just this lump of torso, and he can't communicate with anybody, nor can they communicate with him. It's a devastating situation, as you can imagine, and really grotesque. He first tries to kill himself. He just obviously, right, like anyone would, but the hospital has made it impossible for him to kill himself, so he doesn't even have autonomy over his, you know, his own existence, his own mortality. So the book goes sort of back and forth in time as he thinks about the situations that kind of got him here, why he went to war, what going to war actually looked like, and what some of the reasons were for going to war, and then some of the horrible things that happen in that war. It's just a very powerful anti-war novel. I wish that we still discussed it in schools because I think that teenagers would really respond to the didacticism here. It's not very subtle, and it was published on the eve of World War II in 1938, so I think that this book pretty accurately represents American isolationism and this desire to stay out of wars, and a fear that war is fruitless and nihilistic and, you know, just completely pointless, and that it's this destruction of life, and that war turns life into a symbol because Johnny, unable to communicate his ideas and unable to understand how other people are communicating to him, becomes like a pure tool for government use. So I think this one is a really interesting book, and one that not everybody reads anymore. It was very popular to read in the 60s and 70s, as you can imagine, because of the Vietnam War, but lately has kind of gone out of style. And the last book that I want to talk about is one that I just finished a couple days ago for the first time, and it is Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. I was going to talk about Of Mice and Men because I think that that also accurately represents the time period, but Grapes of Wrath is just an absolute classic and a quintessential book of the 1930s. The book is published in 1939, which is actually really difficult to believe as you're reading it because he approaches the subject of the Dust Bowl and the Depression with such a narrative distance. It seems like he has already placed the Depression into context, and it kind of seems like he is approaching it from kind of like objective historical perspective, but really he was right in it. 1939, the Depression was not over. Yes, we were back on the rise, and with the Lend-Lease Act, war production is starting to pick up, but you know, the Dust Bowl is still devastating for the Midwest. The families that were displaced haven't been able to like go back to their farms, and so I think that his ability to look at this situation from the middle of it is quite amazing. The story is about the Joads, who are Oklahoma natives that are being displaced by the Dust Bowl. They don't own the land, and there is no use farming it anymore. Nobody's going to make their money back. So they get in the car and they move to California. The first half of the book, maybe even the first 2/3 of the book, is about their car trip to California and what a car trip in the 30s would look like. So it's kind of a road novel in that way. Every other chapter kind of generalizes the experience and talks about what everybody else was experiencing, and then the longer sections are about what the Joads are experiencing. And I gotta say, the character development in this book is astounding. It's amazing. He does it mostly through dialogue and mostly through dialect. So it's a slow reading process, but you grow to understand who these characters are, and there are a lot of them, just so clearly. My favorite is Ma, because she starts kind of just looking up to her husband and her younger sons and saying, you know, whatever you guys want to do, I'm going to go along for the ride. But as the book goes on, and as those men in her life prove to be more and more disappointing, she has to really take the reins. And of course, I love a good feminist character. I love even more a feminist character from the 1930s, and I love the way she uses language. This lady is crude. At one point she calls her daughter a little son of a bitch, and that killed me. The other character that I love is Tom Joad, who at the beginning of the novel is just getting out of prison for accidentally killing a man, and is joining his family and basically skipping out on the rules of his parole. He's supposed to stay in Oklahoma, but obviously if he does that, he's gonna die of starvation. And so he follows his family to California, and he's just such a older brother. I'm the oldest in my family, and I just really loved reading about how Tom felt responsibility for his family even when he like just could not fulfill those responsibilities at all. So at points, Grapes of Wrath is maybe overly optimistic about America. That sounds weird because it's about the Depression, it's about people starving to death in America, but there's also this sense of American exceptionalism and this idea that because of American values and because of the American family, we can rise from the ashes, like the literal ashes of the Midwest, and kind of make something of ourselves if only we're willing to cooperate. So the real hero in this book is the central government. There's a government camp that the Joads go to that is just basically utopia for poor people, and what really goes wrong is when capitalists step in and try to just wrest every penny they can from the disenfranchised. But being a bit of a socialist myself and being an American, I didn't mind that kind of idealism, and I also can put it into context of 1939. It makes a lot of sense going into a global conflict and getting out of a national crisis, that a book that is all about the possibilities of Americans to cooperate. It just makes a lot of sense. That's the end of the 1930s. Those are some books published between 1935 and 1939 that you might want to check out. It's a great time period for books. Just some real gritty and political novels coming out in that time. Next week will be the 1940s. I haven't decided yet if I'm going to break that up into two or not, so you can like look forward to that, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.